With materials, you're actually not only limited to the material you can select here, which is also the beauty of the Cycles render engine, because you can layer materials in a really nice node-based approach here. So to do this, I'm going to separate this material as a single user, and I'm going to pull down this view a little bit till here. And then this view I'm going to set into the node editor mode. And what you see here is basically nothing else than this, but it is just represented as a node approach. So I have my diffuse material, the color, the roughness, and it goes into the surface. So what can we do with it? Well, if, for example, I set this one to glossy, I can turn it into a glossy object like this. I can, for example, lower the strength of the reflection, but you see if I lower the strength of the reflection, my object is becoming black, and that's maybe not really actually what I want. Maybe what I want is simply this diffuse object with a very slight coating on top. Think about like a car, you put a primer down and then you put the clear coat over it. So to do this, we can in here press Shift A and then go to glossy and I have a glossy material. Now if I drag this glossy in here, you see that, well, I can only have one material be the input to the surface. So I somehow need to mix those two materials together. So I could go to shader, mix shader, put, for example, A and B into the shader inputs, and then the shader output I put into the surface. And there you can see on the right side, now I have 50% of my diffuse material mixed together with 50% of my diffuse glossy material. So let's set roughness to 0, so it's nice and clean. And if I play with this factor, you can see 0 is 100% the first input, and 2 is 100% the second input. And if I type in, for example, 0.1, I have 90% of my diffuse material with a very small glossy coating on top, so it's very dim. But let's say, well, maybe the edges should be nicely reflective and the center part should be maybe less reflective. So we can't really use factor for it because factor affects the whole object. We can press Shift A and go to Input and select Layer Weight and put the facing into the factor. And then you can see that, for example, the outside is actually nicely reflective. And the more you go to the center part, it's becoming less reflective. So that means it's becoming, where it's tangent, more reflective, and where the surface is perpendicular to the camera, it becomes less reflective. If maybe, let's say, put this one to black, you can see this effect maybe a little bit better. So if I set this to 0, you see it's using more of the diffuse. If I set this to 1, it's then of course using more of glossy. And if I go to 0.01, you can see that from the outside to the center, it fades out. And then when I put the material color back in, you can actually Control C and Control V or Apple C, Apple V with the mouse over a color field actually copy the color information. And you notice that with a color actually applied other than black, the reflections won't be as noticeable. So if I set this to black again, you see this reflection much better, but with the color, for example, you don't see it that much. So this layer weight is basically nothing else than a good tool to simulate, for example, a switch between colors, and that is then based on the geometry. So if a surface is facing you perpendicularly, or if you're looking at it at a tangent angle. And you see it doesn't really matter what you put into the mixer. This one simply, based on the geometry, mixes those two materials together. We can, for example, play this a little bit more. Let's say this one will be 0.2, so it is quite diffuse. And I set this one to 0.1, 0.2, maybe 0.3. See, the bigger the roughness, the more it covers the surface. And then I'm going to duplicate this, or Shift D. And then this shader output I put in here. And then, of course, here the Fresnel or the facing I put in there. So as you can see, I have a diffuse and a rough glossy mixed together. And then the output of this mix shader goes into this another mix shader, and then the layer weight decides where I see the combination of those two, or where I see the new clean glossy going as an overlay over it. And then the output is being put into the surface. So this way you can easily combine